Now we're on the Ayin Omid base. Another incident. This is number 10. Hahi Ravisa. Ravisa is a young girl, and she was an idol worshiper, but again, she was too young to really know much about idolatry. Dishtakach Dahavi Beidina. We find her amongst the barrels of Jewish wine. Vaminekita Ufya Biyade. Now, apparently, when there's wine that's open in a barrel, then it starts to foam around the top of the barrel. And we find that in her hands, she has that foam. And that would certainly indicate that she got the foam from one of the barrels. That's why it's on her hands. And she touched the wine. But yet, Omar Rava Chamra Shari. Why? Amar Migaba de Chavita Shkilta. Apparently, when the foam from the fermentation cooks up, so to speak, it overflows and it falls on the outside of the barrel. And therefore, says Rava, we're going to assume that she didn't go into the barrel with her hands, but rather she touched the foam that was on the outside of the barrel. The Afagav deleka su. And if we look at the barrel right now, we don't see any foam on the outside of the barrel. And therefore, the only foam is on the inside of the barrel. Nevertheless, says Rava, it's mutter. Why? Emer is harumi is ramile. It could very well be that she found some foam on the outside of the barrel that we didn't see, or before the foam was dried up, and so forth and so on. And we could always assume that she came in contact only with the outside of the barrel and not with the wine in the inside of the barrel. Now, Rashi complicates this sugya because he assumes that this girl was not yet old enough to be indoctrinated into Avoda Zara. She knew nothing about libations. She was too young. Enochinami, had she been a grown-up, then Rava would have asked the wine because of the incriminating evidence of the foam on her hands. Whoa. So this is amazing because Rava, according to Rashi, is emphasizing the fact that the mitzias of this case was that she was a Ravisa. Had she been an adult, the halacha would have been different. Now we get to number 11. Hahu Pulmosa the Sultan, right? There was a general. Pulmosa is a general. And he entered Nadoi together with his army. Paslu Chavita Tuva. They started opening up barrels of wine. Kiasar Avdimi Omar. Uvdavi Kami to Rabbi Elazar Visharit. We had a case of Rabbi Elazar in Eretz Yisrael, and he paskined a very parallel case that the yain is mutter. By the way, this is not Rabbi Eliezer that we spoke about before. This is Rabbi Elazar. And Rav Dimi was one of the great Talmidim of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael, who used to come to Bavel and transmit the Torah of his Rebbein. V'lo yadan. Says Rav Dimi, although I'm absolutely certain that in that same circumstance, Rabbi Elazar in Eretz Yisrael was matir, I'm not sure exactly why. Because maybe it's a suffix bia, meaning we don't know if there were Jewish soldiers or non-Jewish soldiers. And Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion, the Omar suffix bia tar, if we don't know if he went into that field or not, then it's tar. Or alternatively, you know why Rabbi Elazar was matir? Mishum de Sava Ruba de Azli Bahade. What's Yisrael? Wow. I never knew until I saw this Gemara that Jews en masse would serve in the army. And therefore, Rav Dimi suggests that the reason why in the case of Rabbi Elazar and Eretz Yisrael he was matir is because the majority of the soldiers that accompany the general in that particular context, in that troop, were Jews. Now, again, Rav Dimi in his first approach said that the rationale for Rabbi Elazar's ruling was based on Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana. And the Gemara says, wait a minute, I don't understand Rav Dimi's logic. Hi, Suffolk Bia, Suffolk Mago. This is not a case of Suffolk Bia. We know for sure in this case that the general, together with his army, opened up the barrels. So that's not a Suffolk Bia. So the Gemara answers, Keva de Mefatche Tuva, right? The soldiers were opening up a lot of the barrels, a massive volume of wine. They weren't interested in drinking. Ema daiti de mamona pasku. Right? They wanted to open up the barrels, take the wine, and sell it on the open market. Now, if there's such a strong assumption that because so many barrels were open, they weren't interested at all in drinking the wine, and therefore we assume that they didn't do any libations or anything like that, then it becomes like a Suffolk beer dummy. Right? What was Suffolk beer? Suffolk beer means it's so far removed. We don't even know if he went into the field. And even if he went into the field, we don't know if he came in contact with the corpse. So that becomes statistically so far-fetched that we say Suffolk tar. Same thing here. The evidence circumstantially indicates that the goyim, these soldiers, were not at all interested in the wine for libations or anything of that sort. Number 12. Oh, a woman is an idolater. And a Jewish woman says to this woman who's an idolater, I sell wine. I'm a wine merchant. Apparently that was a very common Jewish enterprise, like Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi. And I'm going to give you, Miss Idolater, the key to my store, to my geschäft, where all my wine is. Now the question is, this idolater has a key. She could go in, or he, whatever, could go in at any point into the merchant's house where all the barrels of wine are. Should we suspect that there was like that? We had a discussion about this in the Beis Medrash, and we came to the conclusion, Lo Mosra Ella Shmiras Mafteach Bilvad. She was not giving this idolatress the access to her geschäft, to her store. She was giving the key to this idolatress to make sure that the key doesn't get lost. I don't know about you, but in my house, we're always looking for keys. So what we do is we deposit the key in the hands of someone that's trustworthy, and that's what this Jewish woman did. She gave the key to this idolatress. And the Gemara now wants to support this logic. I found this as the underlying reason in a Mishnah in Taros. And the Amoritz was not careful about Tum V'Tara, so now you gave him the key and you allowed him free access, carte blanche, to your kitchen where you have all the food and he's going to touch the food. No, Taros of Taros. We retire everything. Why? When the Jew who's makpid on Tara, very observant, religious Haredi Jew, when he gave him the key to the Amoritz, he wasn't saying to the Amoritz, go into the house freely, free access to my house. He was just depositing the key in his hands to watch the key. Hashta Taros Taros, Yain Esef Mi Boy. Comes along Abaye, and this is going to be a sticky issue in the following Gemara, and he makes a Kal V'chomer, and he says the following: if we're going to be Mitayr Taros, based on this assumption that the Amoritz was only given the key to watch the key, how much more so could we be Matir Yayin Esech? In a case where the Jew gave the key to his, or she gave the key to her geschäft, where she has all the wine, to an idolatrous says, here, take the key, watch the key. So the underlying premise of Abaye is that taharos are more chamur than yayin esach. And if we're makil and we're lenient in the case of taharos, then certainly we could be lenient with the kavachomer in the case of yayin esach. Frek the Gemara. Lememer de taharos halimim yayin esach. Are we more machmir with regard to taharos than we are with yayin esach? The Gemara says yes. Don't be surprised. Tisanya, because we learned Itmar, we learned Chotzer Shechaluka Mesifas. If you have a courtyard that is owned in partnership by two Jews, one is a chaver who's very careful about the laws of Tum V'Tar, the other is an amoritz, he's careless, and there's a mesifas between them. Mesifas is like a marker. It's not a wall, but there's a marker that divides the two parts of the courtyard. And therefore, the chaver and the amoritz own adjacent portions of a courtyard. And what separates the two portions of the courtyard is just a low boundary marker. The chaver leaves his tar, his ochel tar, unsupervised in his half of the courtyard. Rav taros of tmeos. Rav is going to be machmir. He's going to say, well, we're afraid that the amoritz went ahead and jumped over this little, low boundary marker, and he touched the taros, and he was matami them. However, we have to be machmir. Why? Because we're dealing with taros. However, in such a case, if let's say the guy is a partner in the same courtyard, he's on the other side of this low marker, then the halacha is that we could be makil. And we don't assume that the idol worshiper, in a case where the wine was unsupervised, would have crossed over the low boundary marker and came in contact with the wine of the Jew. So the Shita of Rav clearly indicates that we're more makil in Yayin Nesech than we are in Taros. We're more machmer in Taros than we are in Yayin Nesech, which would support the logic of Abaye. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Af Taros of Taharos. Again, that's not really relevant to what the Gemara wants to derive. The Gemara is deriving it and standing on the shoulders of Rav. But we should know that Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rav, and he holds that even as far as the Taros are concerned, we could be makil and assume that the partner, who's the amoritz, would not cross the boundary marker in order to come in contact with the food of the chav. But in any event, we see clearly from Rav that we're more machmir in taras than we are in yayin esach. Meisvei. However, the Gemara is going to challenge this underlying premise based on Rav for a brayso. Now, the brayso is going to discuss two courtyards. One is on the outside, and the one is the inner courtyard. Hapnimis shel chaver. In the first case of the two cases in the brayso, the ratio is the pnimis is owned by the chaver. V'achitzonos shel amoritz. So therefore, the amoritz doesn't have any necessity to enter in to the Chatzah Pnimis. All he needs is access to the Chatzah Chitzoni. He doesn't go all the way in. And therefore also Chaver Shoteach Sham Peros, Meniach Sham Kelim. He doesn't have to worry that the Amoritz went into his Chatzah Pnimis and was Metame the Peros or the Kelim inside the inner courtyard that belongs to the Chaver. V'afal pishi yoda shalam ha'oretz magas l'sham. Even if the marker that separates the two halves of this court, or I should say the two courtyards, right? Not the halves of the courtyard, but the outer courtyard from the inner courtyard, is so low that the Amoritz could simply put his hand in over the boundary and come in direct contact with the food. and yet it's all tahar. Is kasha Rav. Right, Rav said that in the case of the divided courtyard between the Amoritz and the Chaver, the food of the Chaver is Tomei. What's he going to do with this brisa that says that in the case of two courtyards, one inner and one outer, we're not choshesh and it's tar? Rav Shani Hosam Shenitfas Olav Kiganov. Rav says that in the case of the outer courtyard of the Amoritz and the inner courtyard of the Chaver, the Amoritz is inhibited. Again, Mirsas, the old Svar of Mirsas, he realized that if he goes into the inner courtyard, even if he could reach it with a long outstretched arm, he will be prosecuted as a thief. Everyone will assume, why is he doing that? He has no right to go into the inner courtyard. He must be a thief. Toshma, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Okay, now we have another case. We have two houses that are adjacent one to the other, and one house is owned by a chaver, the other is owned by an amoritz. However, the house that belongs to the chaver is higher than the adjacent house that belongs to the amoritz. So it means that the chaver has a very good outpost, so to speak, to see what's going on below. So Shimon Gamliel Omer, Gago shel chaver lemala mi gago shel amoritz, if the roof of the house owned by the chaver is higher than the roof in the adjacent house that's owned by the amoritz, then also chaver shotech shom peros umeniach kelim, then the Jew has, I'm sorry, not the Jew, I should say, the chaver has no inhibitions about spreading out his produce or his utensils on the top of his roof. Because the Amoritz is in the adjacent house and his roof is lower. So how's he going to get to the higher roof where the peros and the kelim of the chaver? However, Rav Shimon Gamliel qualifies this, and he says, "Ubilvad shelo tehei yodo shel Amoritz magas l'sham." If the discrepancy between the height of the lower roof in the house owned by the Amoritz and the height of the higher roof that's owned by the chaver is such that the Amoritz could still place his hand higher and higher until he reaches the fruits that are laid out on the gag, on the roof of the higher roof of the chaver. Is Kash Rabbi Yochanan. This makes sense according to Rav. The Rav says we're always afraid that he'll go over the marker, and therefore we have to be Chosh L'Tuma. Rabbi Yochanan said it's Taros of Tarim, everything is Tar. Amalcha Rabbi Yochanan Shani Hasam, the case of the roofs is different. To Isleish Tamute, Neymar Omar Im Tsure Kamam Tsure. I accidentally extended my hand into the airspace of your higher roof. That's what the Amoritz is going to claim. If he gets caught, he's going to say that I'm just measuring because I intend to erect a structure on my roof. So all the time I'm measuring and measuring and measuring, and what happened is my hand got stretched out into the airspace of your higher roof. So Memela says, Rabbi Yochanan, In such a case, we have to be machmir, we have to be metami the taros, because the amoritz is not inhibited. Even in the worst case scenario, if he gets caught, he has a justifiable excuse. Toshma, gago shel chaver b'tzad gago shel amoritz. What if both roofs are on the same level, equally high? Also chaver shoteach sham perus u'miniach sham kelim v'afal pishiyad shel amoritz magas sham. This is explicitly supporting Rabbi Yochanan against Rav, because Rav says that we're always afraid that the amoritz might have stretched his arm out into the space of the chaver and was matami is taros. Amlecha Rav lav v'ikar Rav Shimon Gamliel dekoi kavase. I know the Amrik Rav Shimon Gamliel. After all, it was Rav Shimon Gamliel who was of the opinion that if Yodo shel amoritz magas, then it's tamei. And even though you found a brisa that rejects Reb Shimon Gamliel, I personally stand on the shoulders and have accepted the shita of Reb Shimon Gamliel. Mishnah. With this, we'll conclude for today. Boleshes shenichnesola ir. Boleshes is a battalion of army people, and they entered into a city, and they entered into a Jewish house. So what's the deal? The question is, the Jew in his house has barrels of wine. And the Mishnah makes the following distinction. B'shas shalom, if it's peacetime, chavios psuchs asuros, tumas mutaros, but b'shas milchama, elu velu mutaros, v'shein p'nai lanas. You may recall we had that svara, that principle, that if the guy is too preoccupied, he's stealing, he's opening up barrels of wine to steal the wine, he's not interested in libations, we're going to use that same logic, b'shas milchama. We're going to say that during wartime, even if the barrels are open, these soldiers have no time for libations. They're on the run. If, on the other hand, it's peacetime, then we have to assume that since the barrels are open, therefore, maybe the troops during peacetime would say, hey, let's have a drink. They're calm and cool. Just to get to the next Mishnah, Uraminu, we ask a kasha, how can you tell me that during wartime, since there's no time for libations there for the ayin is mutter, what are we going to do with the Mishnah that says, Ir shekavshu karkom, a city that was taken over by an army that sieged the city. We have to assume that these soldiers, this reminds me too much of October 7th anyway, that these soldiers would have raped the women, the Jewish women in that city that are married to Kohanim. And the law is that the wife of a Kohen, if she's raped by a goy, is forbidden to her husband. So we're not going to apply the principle that the soldiers are preoccupied with fighting a war. They're going to take their time out, to have this rape situation. And here our Mishnah says we could permit the barrels of the wine because during wartime, the soldiers are too preoccupied with the war to take a break and drink the wine. Amarav Morilin Asech Ein Pnai, but Livol Yesh Pnai. So the Yetzer Hara for Be'ila, even though again this is a rape situation, which I think is a crime of violence, but in any event, the Gemara is assuming that for the soldiers it's a crime of sensual desire, and even these soldiers who are preoccupied with war, they'll find time for Be'ila. So the fact that they're preoccupied with war is not enough to distract them from their great desire to engage in cohabitation, even though it's enough to distract them from their desire to perform libations. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Aleph. See you tomorrow at noon in Mirz Hashem. Is that how we concluded? No. Okay. Have a great day.